At precisely 12 noon, in a drawing room at Clarence House in the mid-1990s, a footman in livery carried a small silver tray across the carpet. On the tray sat a single glass, 1 part gin, 2 parts Dubonnet, a slice of lemon, 2 cubes of ice. The recipe never varied, the hour never varied, the footman never varied. In a desk drawer in the same house, by some accounts in the same room, sat correspondence from Coutts, the royal bankers, regarding an overdraft that by the end of the decade would be measured in millions of pounds. Outside on the gravel sweep, photographers occasionally waited for the smiling figure in the powder blue coat and the feathered hat to emerge and wave. She always did. She was very good at it. She had been doing it for more than 60 years. This is the image that contains the whole story, the porcelain figure on the balcony and the steel underneath, the charm that paid for the gin and the gin that sustained the charm, and the overdraft that quietly financed the gap between the two. Behind the wartime legend of dauntless cheer, behind the corgis and the racehorses, and the hats that became a national affection, the woman the British public knew as the Queen Mother was, in the private estimation of the courtiers who served her, the diarists who dined with her, the in-laws who endured her, and at least one Prime Minister's closest confidant, something quite different from her public reputation. She was a calculating operator who never forgave a slight, never forgot an enemy, and shaped the modern House of Windsor more ruthlessly than any king of her century. The paradox is striking. She was almost universally adored by the British public until her death in 2002, at the age of 101. Crowds queued through the night to file past her coffin. Newspapers that had spent decades exposing every other royal kept her image untouched. And yet the people who actually worked beside her left a parallel record. Sir Alan Lascelles, known as Tommy, who served as private secretary to 2 kings, thought her a brilliant woman of limited principle. Woodrow Wyatt, who adored her and was hardly a hostile witness, recorded conversations with her in his diaries that contemporary readers find difficult to reconcile with the legend. Kenneth Rose, the most sympathetic chronicler the monarchy ever had, noted again and again her capacity for grudge. Hugo Vickers, who interviewed her circle for decades, came away with a portrait of a woman whose preferred weapon was a closed door, delivered with a warm smile. 2 records exist. Both are well documented. Only one is engraved on the memorial outside Buckingham Palace. She was born Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in 1900, the 9th of 10 children of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. The family was old Scottish aristocracy, well-connected, comfortable, and several rungs below royalty. Her childhood was spent partly at the family's London house and partly at Glamis Castle in Angus, the medieval fortress she would later mythologize into something out of a folk ballad. In her telling, Glamis was enchanted, full of ghosts and laughter and tartan. In reality, it was a draughty, expensive pile with a genuinely sinister reputation, and her family's finances were not what the outside world assumed. The myth-making started early. It would never really stop. The crucial point about her origins is not that she was grand, though she was, but that she was not royal. To the House of Windsor in the 1920s, that distinction was enormous. Queen Mary, the formidable consort of George V, came from minor German princely stock and had a continental's exact sense of rank. The British aristocracy, in Queen Mary's view, were subjects, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, however charming, was a subject. Princess Marina, the elegant Greek-born Duchess of Kent, who married into the family a decade later, is said to have referred to her sister-in-law in private as that common little Scottish girl. The remark, whether spoken exactly in those words or not, captures something real about how the existing royal women received her. She noticed. She did not forget. The courtship by Prince Albert, the second son of George V, known in the family as Bertie, has been told so often it has acquired the smoothness of fiction. The standard version. He was shy, he stammered, he adored her. She hesitated out of modesty about the demands of royal life, and at last, in 1923, she accepted. What the standard version tends to skim is that she turned down his proposal of marriage twice before saying yes. Twice. The official explanation was nerves, humility, reluctance to lose her freedom. The private suggestion, made by figures who knew the family well, was simpler. She was making sure of the bargain. Bertie was not the heir. He was the spare, useful and unthreatening, expected to live a quiet life as a minor royal duke. The young woman from Glamis weighed the offer and weighed it again. The third time, she accepted. Within a decade and a half, the calculation would look like the shrewdest decision in 20th century British royal history. The world she entered when she became the Duchess of York in 1923 was a wounded institution, still adjusting to the loss of its European cousins in the First World War. George V was a rigid, irascible man who barked at his sons and softened only for stamps and shooting. Queen Mary was glacial, dutiful, and entirely without humour. The heir to the throne, Prince Edward, was charming and modern, and increasingly, to those who saw him at close range, unstable in his attachments and his judgment. Bertie, the second son, was the family's afterthought. Sensitive, plagued by a crippling stammer, sickly as a child, bullied by his father, he was assumed to require management. His new wife took on the job and was very good at it. She managed his confidence, his temper, his speech, his diet, his diary. She managed, increasingly, his view of his own family. This is where the first piece of evidence for the larger thesis becomes visible. From the moment she entered the royal household, the new Duchess of York understood the workings of power in a way her husband simply did not. She watched. She listened. She learned which courtiers mattered, which were spent, which could be cultivated, which could be ignored. She established what would become her lifelong method. Never write down what you can whisper. Never confront what you can outlast. Never refuse openly what you can refuse by delay. For 13 years she practiced the method in the relative obscurity of a junior royal household, and for 13 years almost no one outside the family noticed she was practicing anything at all. Then, in December 1936, weather arrived. Edward VIII, king for less than 11 months, chose the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson over the throne. Bertie, the stammering spare, became King George VI. Elizabeth, who had expected a quiet life of country houses and christenings, walked into Buckingham Palace as queen of an empire of 500 million people. She walked in knowing exactly whom she blamed. And she was a woman who never forgot. December 1936. Edward has abdicated. Bertie is king. Elizabeth, now queen, walks into Buckingham Palace knowing exactly whom she blames, and she is a woman who never forgets. The conviction settled into her almost immediately, and it never wavered. In letters preserved in the royal archives, and in conversations recorded by Sir Alan Lascelles across the following decade, she expressed a view she would hold for the next 66 years. that Wallis Simpson and the former Edward VIII had, between them, forced a crown onto a man whose health could not bear it. She believed the abdication had killed her husband. She believed it in 1937, when George VI was still in his early 40s. She believed it in 1952, when he died at 56. And she believed it in 1972, sitting beside the woman she held responsible at the Duke of Windsor's funeral. Whether the medical reality supported the charge is almost beside the point. The conviction was the engine. Everything that followed ran on it. The freezing out of the Windsors began at once and never ended. The mechanism was administrative rather than dramatic. She used her influence on her husband and later on her daughter to ensure that the Duchess of Windsor was never granted the style Her Royal Highness, a denial that wounded the Duke more than any financial settlement could have. She arranged that Wallis was not received at Buckingham Palace, not received at Sandringham, not received at Balmoral, not received anywhere a royal woman might reasonably expect to be received by her sister-in-law. The exclusion ran for more than 3 decades and was enforced with a courtier's precision. No public statement, no recorded refusal, simply the perpetual quiet absence of an invitation. When the Duke died in Paris in May 1972, protocol required that Wallis come to Windsor for the funeral. The Queen Mother, then 71, was placed beside her at certain points of the visit. According to accounts left by Lady Moseley, who corresponded with the Duchess in the months afterward, and by household staff present at Windsor that week, the Queen Mother did not address a single direct word to her sister-in-law throughout the entire stay. She smiled for the cameras when the cameras were present. She turned her head when they were not. Wallis, frail and beginning the cognitive decline that would consume her last years, returned to Paris and to her isolation. The Queen Mother returned to Clarence House, and by the testimony of those around her, did not mention the encounter again. This was the pattern. It is essential to understand that she rarely raised her voice and almost never delivered an open rebuke. She worked through omission, through the unreturned letter, the unmade introduction, the seating plan adjusted by a single place. Lascelles, who served 4 sovereigns and had no professional reason to flatter or to wound her, described in his diaries a woman of remarkable intelligence and no scruple whatever in the deployment of it within the family. The institution, he believed, suited her perfectly. It gave her the cover of ceremony for what would otherwise have been visible as ruthlessness. The war supplied the second great theatre. The most famous line associated with her belongs to September 1940, after Buckingham Palace was struck during the Blitz. "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The line is genuine in the sense that she said something close to it. It is also, almost certainly, a refined version, polished in the days after the incident and circulated through her press secretary to the friendly correspondents who handled royal coverage in the wartime press. The visits to bombed streets in Stepney and Poplar were real. She walked through rubble in pearls and pastel coats and spoke to women who had lost their houses. She was, by every account from those who met her in those moments, genuinely warm and genuinely brave. She was also, each evening, driven not to Buckingham Palace, but to Windsor Castle, where the family slept behind walls considerably thicker than any in the East End. The two truths sit beside one another. The image of the Queen who shared London's danger was constructed on a foundation of real courage and real stagecraft, and the proportions of each have been argued over ever since. The line attributed to Hitler, that she was the most dangerous woman in Europe, became part of her legend within her own lifetime. The actual documentary source for the quotation has never been satisfactorily traced. It may have been said. It may have been invented by a sympathetic British journalist. What matters is that she did not correct it. The legend was useful. She let it stand. Behind the wartime image, the campaign against her brother-in-law continued without interruption. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, she lobbied successive prime ministers, her husband's private secretaries, and the king himself to ensure that the Duke of Windsor received no official role, no diplomatic posting of any consequence after the Bahamas governorship ended, and no permanent residence in Britain. The financial settlements were squeezed. The honorary positions were declined on his behalf before he could request them. William Shawcross, given full access to her private papers for the 2009 authorized biography, found correspondence that even his largely sympathetic treatment could not entirely soften. In one letter, she described the Duke as a man who had behaved as no gentleman would dream of behaving. The phrase has the chill of a sentence passed rather than an opinion offered. It is worth pausing on the irony. The woman whose public reputation rested on charm produced in private some of the coldest prose in 20th century royal correspondence. Then, on the 6th of February 1952, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. She was 51. She was a widow, and by every convention of British royal life, she was finished. The throne passed to her elder daughter, the 25-year-old Princess Elizabeth, now Elizabeth II. A dowager queen, in the ordinary course of things, retires to a country house, takes up patronages, writes thank-you letters, and recedes. She did none of it. Within months of her husband's funeral, she had bought the derelict castle of May on the windswept Caithness coast, an entirely unnecessary additional residence that signalled, before anything else, that she intended to acquire rather than relinquish. In 1953, she moved into Clarence House, displacing the young queen and her family, and turned it into what staff and observers across the next half-century would describe as a rival court, its own household of around 50, its own social calendar, its own access to ministers, its own discreet influence on appointments and decisions inside the larger institution. She refused the title Dowager Queen, which she considered aging and diminishing, and instead promoted a style with almost no precedent in British usage, the Queen Mother. The phrase has become so familiar that its strangeness is now invisible. At the time, it was a deliberate construction, designed to keep her central rather than peripheral. It worked. The Townsend affair tested the new arrangement and revealed its character. Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced equerry 16 years older than Princess Margaret, had been close to the family throughout the war years and after. The relationship between him and Margaret deepened through the late 1940s and was, by the time of the coronation in June 1953, an open secret within the household. Margaret was 22. She was in love. She believed, on the basis of the conversations she had been having with her mother for some time, that she would be permitted to marry. The public version of what followed is well known. Church, government, and a reluctant queen forced the separation, and Margaret renounced Townsend in October 1955 in a statement drafted with a private secretary's care. The private version, recorded by Kenneth Rose and corroborated by the friends of Margaret whom Hugo Vickers interviewed across the following decades, is less flattering. The Queen Mother had known about the relationship for years. She had neither encouraged nor forbidden it. She had used the technique she had used in 1936 and would use again. She had waited. She had allowed the situation to ripen until it became politically untenable, and then she had stepped back and permitted her younger daughter to absorb the consequences alone. Margaret, in the years afterward, told friends that her mother's silence on the matter had been the worst part. The Queen Mother's preferred technique with her own children, those friends said, was avoidance dressed as kindness, a closed door delivered with a soft smile. This is the second leg of the case. She did not destroy people with confrontation. She destroyed them with delay, with absence, with the unwritten letter and the unmade decision. The technique left no documentary trail to speak of, which is why it has taken decades for the pattern to emerge from the diaries and the recollections of those who watched it operate from the inside. By the mid-1950s, Clarence House was established. The court within a court was operating at full strength. Margaret was broken. The Windsors were exiled. And the public saw only the hats and the horses. Clarence House in the mid-1950s was, on paper, the residence of a widow in semi-retirement. In practice, it was something rather stranger. A working Edwardian court preserved in the middle of post-war London, complete with 2 pipers, a clerk of the cellar, a page of the back stairs, dressers, equerries, footmen in livery, chefs trained to produce game and soufflé at an hour's notice, and a personal staff that, at its peak, numbered close to 50. None of these people were strictly necessary. All of them were paid. The household ran on a scale appropriate to a reigning sovereign of about 1908, and it ran that way for the next 5 decades, in the residence of a woman who held no constitutional position at all. The performance required infrastructure. A morning at Clarence House began with the delivery of newspapers ironed flat, proceeded through correspondence handled by ladies-in-waiting, and arrived, at precisely 12 o'clock, at the first gin and dubonnet of the day, carried in by a footman on a silver tray. Lunch followed, often for 10, often on plate, often accompanied by wine, selected from a cellar that her household managed, as if she were entertaining heads of state, which sometimes she was. The afternoons might involve racing, or a patronage engagement, or a drive to Royal Lodge. The evening involved another drink, dinner, and frequently the singing of music hall numbers around the piano, at which she was reportedly very good company indeed. Major Colin Burgess, who served as her equerry in the late 1990s, and later wrote about the experience, described the daily traffic of bills with something close to disbelief. Hampers from Fortnum and Mason, training fees for the racehorses, of which she kept a string, dresses from Hardy Amy's and others, ordered in quantities that suggested the wardrobe of a much younger woman with much more public exposure. Flowers replaced daily. Cars, drivers. The Castle of May in Caithness, kept open and staffed for visits of a few weeks each summer. Birkhall on the Balmoral estate. Royal Lodge at Windsor. Each establishment required its own household, its own provisioning, its own quiet hemorrhage of cash. The civil list allowance covering her official expenditure had reached £643,000 a year by 2002. It was not enough. It was, by every account from inside the household, never enough. The shortfall was financed through an overdraft at Coutts, the family's bank, which by the time of her death was reported in the broadsheets to stand at approximately £4 million. The arrangement was not one available to ordinary customers. The terms were quiet, the patience indefinite, the interest negligible. When a member of her staff once raised the question of expenditure with her directly, her reported reply was disarming and complete. "Oh, but I must have a little fun." The little fun was paid for, in the first instance, by the British taxpayer, and in the second instance, by the polite forbearance of a private bank that understood the value of the account. Neither funding source was ever consulted as to whether it would prefer her to have somewhat less fun. The whole apparatus operated on the assumption that the Queen Mother's pleasures were a public good, because the Queen Mother herself was a public good, and questioning the bills was therefore in poor taste. That assumption was, in its way, her most enduring achievement. The same instinct for managing perception over substance can be traced through her dealings with the next generation of royal women. When Diana Spencer married the Prince of Wales in July 1981, the engagement had been, in significant part, the work of the Queen Mother and her closest lady-in-waiting, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, Diana's own maternal grandmother. The two older women had quietly cultivated the match, on the assumption that a shy, well-born Anglican girl of 19 would prove a manageable and decorative consort for Charles. The public image of the Queen Mother during the wedding period was that of a delighted grandmother-in-law, warm and benedictory. In private, as the marriage began to deteriorate across the 1980s, the warmth cooled with extraordinary speed. The Queen Mother sided with her grandson, absolutely and without audible discussion. Diana, in the tapes she recorded for Andrew Morton, and in private conversations later reported by friends, named the Queen Mother as the most frightening member of the royal family she had married into. The fear was not of cruelty in any ordinary sense. There were no scenes, no rebukes, no slammed doors. There was simply the smile, the courteous inquiry, the failure to take a side that was, in itself, the taking of a side. The pattern established in 1936 with the Duchess of Windsor repeated itself in a milder key half a century on. A woman had married in. The marriage had become inconvenient. The family closed around the inconvenience with poisoned politeness, and the matriarch presided and said nothing that could ever be quoted against her. It is at this point in any honest account that the counter-argument has to be given its full weight, because the counter-argument is real. She had loved her husband. The evidence for that love runs through her letters, through her conduct during his illness, through the years of grief that followed his death in February 1952, grief that several of her household described as bordering on collapse before she rebuilt herself at Clarence House and the Castle of May. She was not a woman without feeling. She felt powerfully, and she felt loyally, within the circle of those she had chosen to love. She did genuine work. The list of her patronages ran beyond 300 organizations, many of them small, many of them charities that benefited enormously from her active interest rather than her name on the letterhead. She had been, during the Blitz, physically present in bombed streets when she could safely have remained at Windsor, and the people who met her on those visits were not, by every contemporary account, the victims of stagecraft. They were the recipients of attention from a woman who appeared, in the moment, to care. She was famously charming, an excellent mimic, a generous hostess to her staff at the personal level, remembering birthdays and illnesses and the names of children. She belonged to a generation and a class that did not confess, did not analyze, did not apologize, and judging her by the standards of a later, more confessional age may itself be a form of category error. William Shawcross's authorised biography, published in 2009 with access to her private papers, presents this woman in full. The warmth is documented. The faith is documented. The wartime courage is documented. None of it is invented, and a fair reading of the evidence has to acknowledge it. And yet the evidence on the other side is equally documented by people who had no possible motive to invent it, and in many cases by people who liked her. Woodrow Wyatt, the journalist and confidant who adored her and dined with her often, recorded in his diaries her casual remarks about Jews, her contempt for what she called modern Britain, her conviction that nothing of value had been invented in the country since approximately 1939. Kenneth Rose, the royal biographer who was deeply sympathetic to the institution she served, recorded her capacity for grievance with a quiet astonishment. Sir Alan Lascelles, who had observed her at close quarters across 2 reigns, considered her a brilliant woman of distinctly limited principle. The brilliance and the limits not, in his view, contradictory. These are not the testimonies of enemies. They are the testimonies of admirers, taken down in private, who simply could not pretend not to have noticed. The pattern reached even into her relationship with her elder daughter. Queen Elizabeth II, by every account from the 1950s onward, found her mother extraordinarily difficult to refuse and effectively impossible to fully satisfy. The Queen was the sovereign. The Queen Mother was the mother. In matters of state, the precedence was clear. In matters of the family, of staff, of who would be received and who would not, of how Margaret was to be handled, of how the Windsors were to be remembered, of the shape and tone of royal occasions, the Queen Mother's view prevailed, often without ever being formally expressed. Biographers as careful as Ben Pimlott and Sarah Bradford have documented the deference. It was not the deference of constitutional doctrine. It was the deference of a daughter to a mother who knew with absolute certainty how things ought to be done, and who had outlasted everyone who might have suggested otherwise. What emerges, taken together, is not the figure on the commemorative plate. It is something subtler and more formidable. The public Queen Mother was not a lie. She was a performance, sustained for 66 years, with a discipline that almost no public figure of the century could match. The performance was so complete, so apparently effortless, so warmly inhabited, that even the courtiers and diarists who privately recorded the gap between the image and the reality could not, in the end, quite bring themselves to publish what they knew while she was still alive to read it. She had trained them, across decades, to keep her secrets as a matter of taste. And so she arrived in her late 90s at Clarence House, the gin and Dubonnet at noon, the overdraft growing in a drawer upstairs, the smile intact, the grudges intact, and the family still arranged with patient precision in the shape she had drawn. On the 30th of March 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, the smile was finally set down. She was 101 years old. Princess Margaret had died 7 weeks earlier, on the 9th of February, and the Queen Mother, frail and half-blind, had insisted on attending the funeral in a wheelchair. She outlived her younger daughter by 51 days. It was said she never quite recovered from Margaret's death. It was also said, by those who had watched the long, quiet damage of the Townsend years, that she had been failing to recover from her daughter for nearly half a century already. The lying in state at Westminster Hall drew more than 200,000 mourners, queuing through a cold London spring. The funeral on the 9th of April was, by design, magnificent. The coffin, draped in her personal standard, rested on the catafalque where her husband had lain 50 years before. Soldiers wept, crowds applauded, as the cortege passed. The performance, sustained for 66 years, was honoured at its full value. And then the bills came due. Within months of her death, the scale of the overdraft at Coutts began to leak into the broadsheet press. The figure of roughly £4 million, long whispered inside the household, appeared in print. The Crown quietly absorbed it. There were no inquiries, no reckonings, no consequences. The civil list allowance that had run at £643,000 a year by the end was not, it turned out, the whole story. It had never been the whole story. The 50 servants, the racehorses, the hampers, the silver lunches for 10, the couture, these had been financed in part by indulgent banking, and the indulgence ended only when the customer did. Step back now from the anecdotes and consider what they amount to. The Queen Mother's genius was not political in the ordinary sense. She held no office, she signed no treaties, she made no laws. Her genius lay in the management of perception across 3 generations of a family and across a country that wanted very badly to believe in her. She understood, decades before public relations became a profession with that name, that the monarchy in the 20th century would survive not by power, but by image. And she understood that image could be weaponized inwardly against family rivals as effectively as it could be turned outward toward the public. The charge of cold-hearted manipulator, made privately by figures as different as Sir Alan Lascelles and Diana, Princess of Wales, is not quite right and not quite wrong. She was not cold in the sense of unfeeling. She felt powerfully about her husband, about her dogs, about her racehorses, about her grudges. She was manipulative in the precise and limited sense that she manipulated. Outcomes, perceptions, family decisions, the seating plans of the next 60 years. She shaped them all without ever appearing to lift a hand. The whole palace knew, in the sense that everyone who worked closely with her noticed the pattern, and most of them, like Kenneth Rose and Woodrow Wyatt, recorded it in private and protected it in public. The whole country did not know and was never meant to. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. Consider then what the verdict should be. Here was a woman who saw her husband forced onto a throne he had not been raised for and did not want. Here was a woman who held that family together through 6 years of war, who walked through the bombed streets of the East End in pearls and pastel coats, who refused to send her daughters to Canada when others fled, who genuinely believed, with a force her critics often underestimated, that the institution she had married into was worth defending at any private cost. The wartime courage was not invented. The charity work, 300 patronages and more, was not invented. The warmth toward her staff in individual encounters was not invented. William Shawcross, given access to her private papers for the 2009 authorized biography, found all of it and reported it honestly. And here, simultaneously, was a woman who treated her sister-in-law with 30 unbroken years of silence, who sat beside the Duchess of Windsor at her own brother-in-law's funeral in 1972 and did not speak a single word. Here was a woman who allowed her younger daughter's heart to be broken by delay rather than by decision, and let Margaret carry the public blame. Here was a woman who, having helped engineer the marriage of Diana Spencer to the Prince of Wales, sided silently and absolutely against the bride when the marriage failed. Here was a woman who spent public money as if it grew on the lawn at Birkhall, and who, when warned, said only that She must have a little fun. Both records are true. They are not in competition. The first is the one carved on the memorial. The second is the one in the diaries of the men and women who actually worked beside her. A serious account of the 20th century monarchy cannot choose between them. It has to hold them in the same hand. Return now to where this began. A footman at Clarence House, mid-1990s. A silver tray. The first gin and dubonnet of the day, poured at precisely 12 noon. In a drawer of the same house, the unpaid overdraft running into the millions. On the lawn outside, in a few hours, the practiced smile for the photographer, the powder blue hat, the small gloved wave that an entire country had learned to read as reassurance. That image is not a contradiction. It is a system. The smile paid for the gin sustained the smile. The overdraft was the cost of maintaining the gap between what was seen and what was true. For 66 years, from the abdication crisis of December 1936 to her death in the spring of 2002, that gap was her real residence. Glamis, Clarence House, Royal Lodge, Birkhall, the Castle of May. These were addresses. The gap was where she lived. She was buried beside George VI in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at St. George's, Windsor, the husband whose throne she believed had been stolen for him, and whose early death she blamed, until the end, on the brother and sister-in-law she had outlasted. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor lie elsewhere, at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, in the quieter ground she had spent a lifetime keeping them away from. Even in death, she got the seating arrangement she wanted. 2 graves, a short distance apart, on the Windsor estate. 66 years of grudge, made permanent in stone. The hats are in storage. The horses have been sold. The overdraft has been absorbed. The whole palace had always known. The country, for the most part, still does not. The smile, finally, at rest.